Welcome back to another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm thrilled that you've decided to spend a few minutes of your week with us. We're in the midst of a series that I've called the Sacred Scar Story series. In concert with the release of my new book, Sacred Scars, Resting in God's Promise That Your Past is Not Wasted, we're taking this opportunity to talk to real people who have been through some real pain and woundedness. And yet they've come out on the other side, can look back with hindsight 2020 vision and see how God has brought good out of their deepest pain. Today, I'm talking with my friend Gina Kelly. Her story is shared in Sacred Scars, but I wanted to have her on the program today to have the opportunity to talk more in depth about what she's been through and what she sees God doing as a result. Gina is a friend of mine who is married to her husband, Brian, and she's the mother of two young adults, Joy and Joseph. She works as a pediatric physical therapist in an outpatient clinic and also does some contract work. But one thing you might not know about Gina is that she served as a missionary in Peru, South America, prior to getting married. And she still feels like a little piece of her heart was left in Peru. But we're going to get to see a big part of her heart today as she shares her Sacred Scar story. So, welcome back to the program, Gina.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
You know, because you've listened to the podcast and we talk about it as friends, that sometimes our greatest areas of ministry are the areas where God decides to use us for his good and his glory is directly related to the areas that we've experienced pain in our past. So I would love it if you would share with our listeners an experience that you've gone through that brought about either physical pain, emotional pain, relational pain, spiritual pain, or some combination of the aforementioned.
Yeah, as I look back in my life, there definitely is one moment that was kind of a defining moment. And it happened a little over 45 years ago. I was 11 years old, almost 12. And I'll let you guys do the math for that one. But I was a sixth grade student, which at that time was the oldest students in the elementary school. And as a sixth grader, some of us were chosen to be crossing guards. We did not have buses to bus the students to school. So when I was a sixth grade crossing guard and was crossing the street to get to my post, I was hit by a pickup truck. It was driving. I didn't see it. I know it was red. I remember a flash of red. And then I flew, they estimate 100 to 125 feet in the air and landed in a snowbank. I suffered many physical injuries. So if I look back at the most pain physically I've ever experienced in my life, it definitely would have been related to that accident, the trauma, the physical suffering I had there. Some of my injuries were I had a skull fracture on the right side, which left me, I'm still deaf in my right ear. I had complete facial paralysis on the right side, six broken ribs on the right, and my right lung was collapsed. So, just physically, my body went through a lot during that. That carried some emotional scars too. For over 2 months, the right side of my face was completely paralyzed. So I was just getting ready to enter middle school when I had to wear a clear eye patch when I went outside because I couldn't close my eye. My smile was very asymmetrical and things. So a lot of sort of insecurities with my physical body, with not feeling beautiful. Like there was a lot of emotional scars that happened as well as the physical scars I have from the accident. So there have been other times I've, suffered a lot of pain or things, but that would be probably one of the defining moments that God allowed scars that I've also seen him use throughout my life for my good and for his glory.
I can relate on several levels. You know my story, but I can
Yes.
relate to the physical deformity that I suffered when I was a little girl. But what is interesting, and our audience would have no other way to know this than if I share it right now, and that is the fact that you went through that accident and suffered the way you did, that is in large part why we are friends today, because I went through a car accident and suffered some injuries. And that was when you reached out, a perfect stranger reached out to me because you could relate to my experience. So that's just one way that God used the wounds that you went through for someone else's good. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm not grateful that you had to go through that experience,
Yeah.
but I'm grateful for the good that God brings out of it,
Yeah.
because that is directly related to the scripture that says, and we will comfort others with the comfort
Mhm.
we have been given. And
Receive.
that's exactly what you did.
Yeah.
In what way, Gina, when you look back as a child, having gone through this, and we know children are cruel, children are honest to a fault. In what way did these wounds, the physical or emotional wounds, cause you to experience shame or fear or insecurity or hold you back from even walking in freedom?
Yeah. Even before the accident, I can talk to just about anybody now, but I was really kind of reserved and shy. And after the accident, there were two feelings I remember. One was it was like I was in a fishbowl because I come back to school and everyone's curious
Mhm.
about the girl who almost died, the
Right.
girl who changed things. It didn't happen immediately, but they hired adults to do what they had a child doing before. So I guess that's something good that came out of it. They did not put another sixth grader in the role of responsibility. But I all of a sudden, someone who liked to kind of shrink back into kind of hang in the out in the edges of society was everyone wanted to know what happened. And I was just, I guess, seen, and that made me uncomfortable. But then I did suffer some cruelness. I remember specifically being part of the sixth grade spelling bee. I was out of school for about 2 weeks. And it wasn't long after I came back that the sixth grade spelling bee, there were 5 elementary schools. So all the sixth graders, they brought us together and I'm standing on stage. And in the very front row of the audience were 2 boys from a different elementary school. And every time I went up front, they made faces at me and they pointed. And I was nervous, anyways, trying to remember how to spell these words.
Right.
And I just remember that moment, crying with my parents after we left. It was probably good my father didn't know who those boys were while we were
Mhm.
still there.
I know
Um,
your dad, so I know that's probably a
he's
good
very
thing.
protective. But so there was just this shame of like, I didn't want people to see my deformity. And so for, I don't know, from sixth to ninth grade, probably for 3 or 4 years or so, if something was funny, I'd laugh, I'd go like this,
Mhm.
not realizing that covering what
Mhm.
I was ashamed of just drew
Right.
attention to it. Like
Yes.
if I just smiled. I will say that I was blessed. God brought a surgeon into the surgeon who did my first surgery. They did surgery immediately after my accident, and he was not able to bring about any change. The facial paralysis didn't change, the deafness didn't change, but he just so happened to have done his residency under one of the leading facial paralysis experts in the nation.
Wow, I
And
didn't
so
know that part of your story.
he was able to get me in to see Dr. May in Pittsburgh, Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. And when we went there 3 months later, Dr. May looked at me and he said, I think I can help. He told my parents, so they scheduled surgery. One interesting thing is my eyelashes on the right, when my facial paralysis happened, my eyelashes went straight. He'd never seen that. So he took pictures. So in some textbook, this much of my face is, we signed all the releases, so my face is in a textbook somewhere. And after he did the surgery that released the pressure, there was a bone fragment compressing the nerve wasn't dead, so when he removed that, my mom said that there was a corner, she could just see the corner of my mouth was relaxed a little bit. So For the next 2 to 3 years, I started to get back the amount of movement I have. There's still facial asymmetry, but during that period of time, those 3 years, is when I really battled with it and would cover it. And I was blessed to have one youth leader specifically who just sat with me in my pain, listened to me, spoke truth into me. And little by little, I found I didn't have to cover up my smile. I still see it. I'm not going to lie. I'm still aware of it. I know later on we may talk about some of the lasting effects, but that was probably one of the hardest. You don't see the deafness in my right ear, but um, that also at times is hard to feel like I'm not hearing everything, I'm missing out. If I'm in a crowded room and someone calls my name, I have to spin in a circle to kind of tell which direction. So, um, but I can hear out of my left ear. So probably haven't noticed as many people noticing that I'm deaf in one ear
Mhm.
as would have noticed the visible changes to my face, the scars there.
And as someone who knows you and has walked with you for a long time, I don't see any of that.
Thank you.
Any of that. We've spent time together, and sometimes you have to remind me, can you walk on this side of me? Because I don't see it. I see a beautiful, godly woman. But isn't that interesting
Mhm.
that those things that we're often ashamed of or embarrassed about or try to cover up were fed lies from the enemy?
Yes.
And that makes us want to shrink back or hide or cover up when God thinks it's beautiful. I look at you and I think it's beautiful, but that's where the enemy goes. So I would be curious to hear from you if there were any specific lies that you heard in your head, maybe that you didn't realize they were lies at the time, because I think
Mhm.
that's how the enemy works. He like slips in, especially when we're children, and says things to us. And I'm wondering if when you think back, is there anything specific that you think back and go, well, that's not even true. That was from the enemy. That's not what God says about me.
As I said, it's been 45 years
Mhm.
since my accident. And just over the past couple months, God has been revealing to me some lies that I've still held on to since childhood. And um, part of it came from a time I work with our youth group at church. My husband and I have stepped up, and I was at a conference with the youth. And there was a time where someone received what they call a word of knowledge, like they were prompted by God to pray for someone. And they specifically said someone who has difficulty with hearing or is deaf in their right ear. And I'm a youth leader taking youth to a conference, thinking I'm here so that the youth can get what they need at the conference. And I felt literally like there was a spotlight just coming down. And because they said, raise your hand, I did. What happened after that was I was brought on stage. They prayed for healing. In the physical, I haven't noticed a change. But what that time of prayer brought about in my life was realizing that since my accident, no one had ever prayed for me and for what I had gone through. Like as a little girl, I made it through, I was alive, and my whole life has been praising God for the miracle he did and keeping me alive. But there was something about going back and just specifically praying over that area. And one of the leaders literally touched the areas of the scar, and I hadn't told him where it was, but as he was praying over me, he touched my scar. And God revealed to me that I was still seeing myself as broken. And that was a lie. And I have, some journaling just from April, where I journaled that God says you are not broken. There was a part where, because I have difficulty hearing physically, I had believed that I couldn't hear God speak very well either, that there was a spiritual
Mhm.
part of that. And so, literally, the past, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, I have been really seeking God and praying to Him and hearing from Him that you can hear me. And so I kind of smile. I would always, if I'd sense His presence, I would sense it on my left. And at one time during some prayer time and journaling time, I had heard in my heart, just sensed in my heart that God was like, I will always position myself so you can hear me. So whenever I sense like Jesus is near, he's always on my left side. Since this time of prayer, since God's been speaking over me, you're not broken, sometimes he's on the right side.
Mm,
And that is just very cool for me because if he can raise dead bones, dead things back to life, he can speak into a deaf ear and it can hear. So I have no idea what's going to happen in the physical, if I will ever hear in stereo again. But God is speaking to me that I can hear him. It doesn't matter which ear.
I love that. I love that, that even 40 something years later,
Yes.
more healing can happen.
Yes.
Yeah. Talk about how God has healed the either the physical or maybe in your case, given how you've shared your story, maybe even some of the emotional wounds and formed a sacred scar that is being used for good.
Mm. Yeah, as I look back over the course of my life, and there are other defining moments in my life, but seeing the accident, some of the things that are very apparent to me, ways that God redeemed what happened in that moment and since then, is it led me into my current profession. As you mentioned, I'm a pediatric physical therapist. From a very early age, I would wonder things like, what are the regenerative properties of the human nervous system? Like most 14-year-olds aren't sitting in their room
Right?
pondering these things,
Yeah.
but God just like opened up just this desire to earn more and not just to learn more, but to be able to use what I learn and to use my experience to help others. When I worked as a physical therapist, I worked as a physical therapist when I went on the mission field and was able to spend time working in a school for children with special needs, sharing the love of Jesus, but also using my hands. We didn't have many tools in the jungles of Peru, so it was
Right.
mainly my hands to help show them God's love. And there was one moment in particular that we had a clinic. We saw children during the day, but in the afternoon hours, people from the community could come. And there's one main road that goes across Peru from Lima on the coast, across the mountains to the jungle. And during the rainy season, there's often accidents. And this woman was on a bus that tumbled down the Andes Mountains and she survived. Her husband got her back home to the town where I live, Pucallpa, and brought her in. She had serious injuries. We were working on getting her stronger. And most of the time, one of the other missionaries, who was also a physical therapist, would work with her, but it was Missy's day off. So I'm working with the client, and her husband was almost rude in his directness, but he said, "What's wrong with your face?" Okay, 11-year-old would have crumpled in a ball and just about like tried to fall off the face of the earth. But in that moment, God showed me, this is your opportunity. So I told them about my accident. I told them about how even in the hospital, I sensed God's presence and I knew I would be okay. I spoke to them of how, you know, doctors have no idea why I'm still standing. They will, when I say it's a miracle, they have nothing better. So they're like, we'll call it that. And as I spoke to them and talked to them about Jesus, the wife first said, I want to know Jesus. I want to know him more personally. And the husband and I was able to sit there and pray with both of them to share the basics of the gospel, that Jesus died on the cross, that he rose again, that he wants to offer them life in a relationship with them. They need to respond to his invitation. And so sitting in this little physical therapy room in the jungles of Peru, I was able to share. If I had that perfect smile
Yeah.
that I pined over, that I prayed for, that I wept for all those teenage years, I don't know if he would have asked me about my faith.
Right.
During that same time, there was a young girl who in that area of Peru in the jungles, a snake had bit her leg and she left her leg. She lost the bottom part of her leg. They had to amputate. And so she was struggling with how she looked and with adapting to her body being different. And I was able to show her the scars behind my ear, to tell her my story, to show her my crooked smile and how I can only raise one eyebrow, all the little tricks I've got because of that. And it helped her see that she was okay. It's okay to be different. And so God just really spoke to me in that time that He has set these like stones of remembrance. My scars can be something that when people ask me about them, when I have to ask someone to repeat something, when I have to ask someone to move to the other side so I can hear them, that I can either see that as a nuisance or I can see that as an opportunity to explain the goodness of God and what He did.
I like how you just phrased that. You can either see those scars as a nuisance
Mm-hmm.
or as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think that's what God offers to us, but He's not going to make us choose.
No.
That's the free will.
Yes.
But in the hands of a redemptive God, what we view as broken,
Mm-hmm.
He views as beautiful because, like I've said in the book Sacred Scars, our scars are really the tapestry on which we can see God's healing hand. And
Yes.
sometimes I have to say this because I know some people are listening and all they want is healing for X. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we don't receive the healing that we most want, but God is still working and healing other areas that He knows are more important. So while you and I may have longed, especially as 10, 11, 12-year-old girls, because we know how girls are,
Yes.
especially in middle school, while
Mm-hmm.
we may have longed for physical healing and to
Mm-hmm.
be taken back to our pre-injury
Yeah.
state, God is busy working us emotionally or
Mm-hmm.
relationally or spiritually in our walk with Him.
Yes.
And while I still desire that physical healing, I'm grateful
Mm-hmm.
for the healing that He has given. And I remember there was once, Gina, when we hosted some evangelists who came through town and they were going to do a tent meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the leaders asked what was wrong with my legs and my feet. And he was so resolute that I needed to come to that meeting for physical healing.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time I remember thinking, I don't need that. I don't need God to heal
Yeah.
my leg and my foot because to me, just like you with your asymmetric smile or one eyebrow that goes up or doesn't, that is still a testimony that God saved our lives.
Mm-hmm.
What greater gift is there than that? I didn't need that physical
Mm-hmm.
healing at the moment. And I thought it strange that that's what he was focusing on.
Yeah.
But I just want to underscore, friends, if you're listening, maybe you don't have a physical scar, but you feel broken in some other way. Maybe you've had an unfaithful spouse or a prodigal child, or maybe you've struggled with addiction or depression or anxiety. Can I just tell you that your brokenness is still beautiful to God? In Sacred Scars, I talk about that Japanese pottery, and I never know how to pronounce it. I think it's kingzu, but basically, it's when pottery is broken
Mm-hmm.
in the Japanese culture. They don't do away with it like we tend to do in Western society. Like we throw things away and we get new, but they seal the brokenness with precious metals like
Mm-hmm.
gold and platinum. And then they look at that has been formed and they think it's even more beautiful because of the brokenness. And I think that's true with God because scripture tells us if we're going to be Christ followers, we are going to participate in his suffering.
Yeah.
We're going to experience pain, but the question is, what do we do with it? So, Gina, I know you've been through a lot and you still continue to work in the helping profession. You work with children who
Mm-hmm.
struggle with areas. And I love specifically that you work with children primarily because you can relate as a child who went through something difficult and needed
Mm-hmm.
therapies and surgery. But if a listener is listening in our on our conversation today and they're identifying with some area of brokenness or pain or woundingness. What hope-filled perspective do you want to leave them with today?
I think one of the biggest things God keeps showing me is that He continues to want to bring healing. I know I've heard you speak of the story of the woman with the issue of blood for 12 years, and she waited 12 years and expected and was wanting God to heal. For me, in a lot of ways, it feels like it's been 45 years, and 45 years can be a long time, and yet I'm just smiling, going, God isn't finished. He is using what happened as a child. And that's not the only thing I've been through.
Yeah,
But what can happen is when you see that God's faithfulness in one situation, and then when a rocky part of your marriage hits in your 30s, when your children are struggling with things that you can't fix,
yeah,
when your parents begin to decline and it's hard to watch that path,
yeah,
what God has shown me, what I even see when I see the physical scars that remain, speak of a God who continues to heal. And the healing, I benefit, but it's not all for me.
right.
I also am able to speak hope into a young family that I've met. I believe it's going on 3 years ago. Their two daughters were hit by a car and nearly died. And so I was connected with them because of our stories. And the
Mhm.
mother will look at me and she says, I've never known anyone else who's gone through what my girls went through. Those two and I have this bond of shared experience, and they have a faith in God, but I can even help the mother have hope that her girls are going to be okay, that God can and will use it for good, even though right now it can seem overwhelming. And I understand differently my accident from my parents' perspective now that I'm a parent.
Right.
As a child, I saw it from what God did for me, but watching my parents walk with faith
Mm.
through things. So if you're a parent and maybe what's happening is happening to your child and it feels overwhelming, God is there. He will cradle your child. He cradled me as a child. He can take care of them. And I remember my father saying that God reminded him that God loved me even more than my father loved me. That concept of as great as a parent's love is for their child, that the father's love is that much greater, that his desires for them are for good. And so it's never too late for healing in your own life. And God is faithful and can care for those you love, even if they're children, especially if they're children, because I think a lot of times a child can have a childlike faith that we're
Mhm.
all called to have and
Right.
can encounter God and can encounter Jesus. Looking back at my life, would I choose to be hit by a truck again? Not for what I went through physically,
Mhm.
but if that is the only way that I can know my God will hold me and love me and care for me in the most physical pain I've ever experienced, the greatest brokenness I've ever experienced,
Mhm.
if that will give me a faith that's unshakable, little things don't compare to that because I've seen God work in the big,
Yeah.
then I would go through it again.
Mhm.
Because in many ways, I am who I am today. I can relate to my patients. I have street cred. When I have to look at their scars from their surgery, I can't let them see all of them, but I've got one that's really accessible behind my ear. And I've been in the emergency room. I've been in ICU. I've been in the hospital. I've, teetered on the brink of death. So the parents will look at me and go, okay, she gets it a
It
little bit.
gets
So if
Mhm.
I can be used by God to touch someone else, then it was worth it. It is worth it.
You are a person that has more compassion and more mercy than just about anybody I know. I would be hard pressed to think of somebody who has more compassion and mercy than you do.
Thank you.
And I have to believe that's in large part because of the suffering you've endured. And you're able to look at people who are hurting from a
Mhm.
different perspective,
Yeah.
from that perspective of, I get it. I get
Mhm.
it. I've experienced the physical wounds. I've experienced the emotional wounds, and to some degree, even some spiritual wounds, perhaps
Yeah.
relational wounds with those peers or the man in Peru who very bluntly says, "What's wrong with you?"
Yeah.
So, friends, I want you to hear your struggle, your pain point, your wounds may not be physical in nature. Maybe they are, but they're different. They're not hearing loss or facial paralysis. But God can and will redeem what was lost. And that's the faithfulness of our God. But his question to all of us is, will you trust me through it? Probably all of us have heard Romans 8:28. And we know that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But the question is, will we trust him to work for good our pain in his perfect way and his perfect time? Just speaking for myself, not speaking for anyone else. Sometimes I get really impatient. I've been waiting 54 years for healing, but in the span of eternity, that's just a blip. That's just a heartbeat. And if my total healing doesn't come until I get to heaven, I get to spend a whole lot more time fully healed than suffering with scars. So, friends, I hope that you're encouraged today by Gina's vulnerability, by sharing about what she went through, but also by her testimony of God's goodness and faithfulness through it. God is no respecter of persons, which means he doesn't play favorites. And so the faithfulness that he offered to Gina, the faithfulness that he's offered to me, he offers to you. And so I hope that you take that with you this week. Whatever your area of pain or woundedness is, remember that God is faithful and he will see you through. But his question to you today is, will you trust him? Gina, thank you for sharing from your pain. Thank you for being real and honest and vulnerable about one of the most painful experiences that you've gone through and how God has used it for good. Friend, I'm enjoying the Sacred Scars series, and I hope that you are too, because these are real people sharing real stories. And God doesn't call all of us to write books and be on the stage. Sometimes he calls us to sit with another family who goes through something that we've been through. Maybe he calls us to sit down over coffee with our neighbor and just listen because we get it. Will you consider allowing God to use your painful experience to comfort someone else? Because there is nothing better than that. Friends, I look forward to another Sacred Scar story with you next week. In the intervening time, it's always my prayer for you that you will have a hope-filled week.